Hello and welcome to the presentation on studying plot. This is Shannon McGregor, your instructor for this literature class. Before you progress any further into studying plot, I would like you to make sure that you have read The Story of an Hour because I hope to discuss a few items from that story as we go through. So stop and pause if you have not read it. If you have read it, continue. Okay, I'm going to go through this plot diagram. This is just an approximation, just a little visualization to help you understand how plot happens in a lot of literature. Okay, the 5 parts are on the screen here. First, the commencement. I'm also going to call that the exposition on occasion. So it essentially means the introduction to the piece. And I'll detail that a lot more on the next slide. So after you have the start of things and you understand the beginning and the set and the main characters and everything, then usually a conflict occurs. And it's probably a minor conflict, or it's just maybe revealing what's going to be the main conflict in the work. And when that happens, then it moves into a thing called the rising action of the play or short story or narrative poem. So the rising action, when it comes to its highest point, that is known as the climax of the work. And so when the greatest point of conflict occurs, there might be lots of little bumps along the way, but the highest point of conflict is called the climax. When that has occurred, then usually you have a release and you start seeing the conclusion, you start seeing the ending of it, things start getting resolved in the declining action, and then when everything is finished and wrapped up, that's what's called the denouement, or another word, and as your book tells you, it's the resolution is a more appropriate term for that. So let's dig into the nitty-gritty details of each of these sections of plot. Okay, so if we have a definition of the plot development or plot sequence is what I'll refer to this as well. All right, so we have 5 tenets. If we look at what is included in the commencement or exposition of the work, this is where the protagonist is revealed, and you get to see his or her flaws, or wants, needs, desires. What is the issue is a question that you could ask in order to figure out what the greatest point of conflict is going to be, or what the protagonist is going to face. So you get a lot of information about the protagonist in this piece. You get a lot of background information and setting, that's time, place, environment, the mood of the piece. You get some foreshadowing to the conflict, and you also get to know the antagonist and other characters that are in the play. This is typically where they are introduced, and not until you see the antagonist's intention or the way that they want to harm. That's a pretty strong word, but if we're thinking of classical villains and everything, where you get to see where that villain wants to harm the protagonist, that's when it changes from the commencement into what's called the rising action. And one more comment about the protagonist and the different characteristics of each of the characters, actually, that you will experience in the commencement is you get to know either directly by the character, him or herself, stating the qualities about themselves, or the narrator directly states the personality and the qualities of the character. So this is where you get to know that the knight is this wonderful, valiant. This knight has slayed every dragon, and he behaves like every chivalric knight should behave, and you get to know the qualities of the protagonist specifically, but also a lot of the other characters. You get to learn, are they kind of calm characters? Are they exciting characters? Are they kind of silly? Are they meant to be the comic relief or the jester of the piece? And with the antagonist, you get clues that what this person is like and who's going to be the antagonist, but usually not until their actual intents are revealed do you have the rising action occur. Okay, so either directly from the characters themselves, from the narrator, or indirectly just by some of the situations that are occurring. And if we go to the example of A Story of an Hour, we get some foreshadowing in there about what's going to happen to the protagonist. Now, you got to think, who is the protagonist of the piece? Who is this work about? What main character is this work about? And then you have to decide, who is the antagonist? Who or what is the quality or character that is working against the protagonist? And that can be a little difficult. Okay, so during the raising action, this is where the characters are developed more thoroughly. Again, the antagonist, you get to see what this person is actually about. If they are going to challenge, if the antagonist is going to challenge the protagonist, you get to know what the intents are. Shakespeare was really good at revealing that in Act 2. Guess where on the plot diagram the rising action is? That would be Act 2 in Shakespeare. So when you're looking at drama, you can kind of use some of those clues to figure out where the height of conflict is going to be. But where the characters are developed thoroughly, so you get to see their insecurities, you get to see their strengths, you get to see a lot more about each of the characters, but specifically about the antagonist. You get to see the plot that they're going to form against the protagonist. Again, that's foreshadowed or directly offered from some villains. Iago in Othello was wonderful about revealing his direct intents. He said what he was going to do, and then the man did it to Othello, and it's just really fun to watch and read about. So as we look at more of the characteristics here, the last one in the rising action is the protagonist's ability to overcome the flaw or the tragic end because of the flaw is revealed. Yeah, it kind of sounds kind of silly. So let's think about this for a second. The protagonist's ability to overcome the flaw, or how about whatever the issue is, the protagonist's ability to overcome the issue. Now, in in classical plot structures or sequences, the hero or heroine has a flaw. If it's tragedy, it's going to be a tragic flaw. If it's comedy, it's often just going to be a flaw, or sometimes it's not. In more modern works, it's not always a case of this flaw of the protagonist, but just an issue that protagonist faces. And that means that I kind of need to talk to you before we get into the next part about the difference between comedy and tragedy, because comedy, of course, it's funny, haha, but it's also the way that most comedies, Shakespearean comedies in particular, end is with a wedding, or with a very happy event or a celebration of some sort. And the way that tragedy ends classically, or Shakespearean tragedies typically end, is with a person dying or experiencing a social death. Oedipus Rex is a tragic drama about a man, and he's trying to keep from doing what his seer is telling him is going to happen, and so his family even gets rid of him so that he won't come and kill him, or kill his father. But when he goes to this other family, and then he learns of his future and that he's predicted to kill his father and marry his mother, and of course, he wants to escape that fate. So what does he do? He goes away, and where does he end up? At his real father's house. And what does he do? Okay, so this tragic flaw and this thinking that he can overcome fate is one of the main flaws that Oedipus has, and his ability to overcome it is not good, because it's fate, it's destiny. You can't escape these things. And so by the end, he dies. It's not a death, it's more of a social death in exile rather than a physical death. So that's another kind of trait to tragedy in plot that happens. Now, and then you heard me a little bit ago talk about comedy, and that it usually ends up in a wedding or a celebration. Understand that those are classical examples, and which you do see still today. I mean, you go to any what people call chick flicks, those romance movies, or these people try to overcome themselves, and what do they end up doing? They end up falling in love with the guy they said they weren't going to fall in love with, or woman that they said they weren't going to fall in love with, and it ends up in happy, happy, joy, joy type of ending, and wedding. So you've got to kind of think of that. What is the quality and the mood that was said at the very beginning, and what is it going to end up being by the end of the work? Those are big hints that you can use in order to determine, okay, if I have this comedy, what is the flaw that this person has? It's not going to end his or her life, but what's going to be overcome by the end. But if it's a tragedy, this person is not going to be able to overcome it, and they're going to have to deal with that fact. And there are lots of Latin words and whatnot that we could be throwing around here, but simply stated, that this is what the rising action and that transition into the climax and the development of a particular short story or drama is. So let's now talk about the climax. And we've been talking about this idea of the highest point of conflict. Well, what does that imply? That there are lots of conflicts throughout the work, but it's the highest point of conflict that actually defines the climax. So if we're looking, if we are looking at these little battles, these little skirmishes along the way, they are not the climax, because it wouldn't be the actual battle or the final battle. It might be a battle before the final battle and everything is discovered. We'll talk about this in relation to The Wizard of Oz and a little bit of the Story of an Hour in a little bit. How do you know that the climax is finished? It's the highest point is where the protagonist and the antagonist, whether that's the internal conflict or whether it's this other person, this external conflict or nature or whatever else, when that clash produces the result for that protagonist either to be able to overcome the flaw or to be killed by the flaw, essentially. And one important component to the climax is that the climax is defined by the protagonist's issue, not the antagonist's issue. Okay, so it doesn't matter that the antagonist has been defeated per se. It's, did the protagonist overcome his or her issues? I think The Wizard of Oz is a great example of that, and we'll talk about that. So some of the things that you have to do from the very beginning, these terms that you keep seeing over and over again, protagonist, antagonist, foreshadowing, and conflict. You have to deal with each of those as you're moving through this piece in order to really be able to define the parts themselves. So let's move on to declining action. The declining action is when the tension in the conflict releases. It's been the last battle. You know whether the person has won or lost or has been brutally beaten. However, what is the ending going to be? You start seeing that come alive and be revealed. So you can see that whatever the end is, tragic or comedic, whatever the end is for this protagonist is coming to a close, and then finally you have some resolution or the denouement. And that's where the central conflict is absolutely resolved, wrapped up in a nice package. And sometimes it's not so nice of a package. Maybe there are some lingering questions. Why did the author put those lingering questions in there? Nonetheless, the conflict itself, even if there are other things that still have not been addressed directly or completely, that protagonist's fate or the conflict itself is final. You're not going to get any more of the story. Okay? So let's kind of talk through this idea of, is there a nice, neat little triangle like you see in the upper left-hand corner when it comes to the plot sequence? Quite frankly, it's not. If you look at almost any Shakespearean play, you will note that the longest acts and the majority of the play take place in Acts 1 and 2. Act 3 is really intense, and then Acts 4 and 5 are very short. And so I think that this is a better reflection of whether or of a plot progression than the last triangle was, because it shows how long that rising action sometimes takes and where it divides and goes into the actual climax, where the greatest conflicts start occurring. However, I still don't think this is a very appropriate triangle or drawing, because don't most really good plots look like this? Yeah, most definitely. With the story of an hour, if we look at that for a moment and we define who is our protagonist, and we think about the very opening of that short story, some news comes to our to Mrs. Mallard, and Josephine and is there to be able to help her work through it. She's been told very gingerly by these other folks, but who is the one that this plot follows throughout the whole plot or short story? It's Mrs. Mallard. All right, that Mr. Mallard, it's the tragic accident that has occurred is all about him. However, this story is about her. It is about her conflict. It is about her issues. And whether you're defining the antagonist as Mr. Mallard, or maybe even Josephine, who keeps knocking on her door and trying to help her, or whether you think it's Mrs. Mallard because of her internal conflict of dealing with the death of her husband, no matter what you think this is, even that plot, with how brief it is, it takes off right at the beginning, and then it kind of plateaus when she's upstairs. You're expecting her to cry, etc., and she does a little bit, and then she starts, oh my gosh, she starts sensing the freedom, and she rises, and then she kind of, it kind of levels off just a little bit, but then she's saying this free, 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 and then what is the central or highest point of conflict? How can we determine that in that particular work? And I'm not going to answer that question in this particular presentation, because I want you to discuss that. That's why we have these discussion questions for our online class, and that's also part of what we have to talk about in class. So let's use a more universal example that we can all kind of tie to. Do you remember The Wizard of Oz? Our protagonist in that particular piece, I would hope you would know, would be the main character, Dorothy. And there are a few other main characters who are included in that particular work, but whose issue ultimately is this? And well, if you want to go to the movie version, you want to really think it through, whose dream is this? That she's gone to this magical land and is no longer in Kansas. Who is the story about? It's about Dorothy and wanting to go home, and her wanting to feel like she's in a place that is worthwhile. She was running away from home at the beginning, but this takes her completely away from home, and all she wants to do is go back to home. But she has to deal with several things. And there are some terms that we want to think about. Let me bring up my pointer here. I've mentioned a few times the idea of internal conflict, and I'm so sorry, this is like the handwriting of a kindergartner. Internal conflict. There's also an idea of external conflict. Internally, Dorothy is upset. She's upset with her Auntie Em. She's upset with her circumstance. But really, what is her ultimate conflict? It's wanting to be bigger and older and feel strong and needed, and dealing with that coming of age type of story. And it's also about her just wanting to go home, understanding that she had the tools to do this all along right there at home before she ran away, before she was taken to the wonderful land of Oz. Externally, she has a couple of different antagonists, if you will, and that would be an internal antagonist, a man versus man, or in this case, Dorothy versus Dorothy. She's her own worst enemy. That's an internal conflict. If we go back to external for a second, externally, she thinks in the beginning that Auntie Em and some of those other folks are against her, and specifically, oh gosh, who's the lady? Oh, down the road who hates Toto, and that's what makes Dorothy leave in the first place. Anyway, she's the woman who becomes the Wicked Witch of the West in Oz. So externally, she actually has a physical representation of somebody who is angry with her and who's going to hold her back. So it's man versus man, or woman versus woman, literally in that sense, that this witch is trying to keep Dorothy back. Even Oz, the wizard, who is supposed to be so helpful, keeps her back for a while until she's able to go get the broom and overcome the witch. He doesn't really help her out. And then at the end, what happens? She gets the broom, she defeats the witch, and then she goes to Oz, and then everybody else gets their prize, and she's gonna go home. But what happens? The balloon takes off with the wizard without her. And so now how is she going to get home? So with defining some of these points of conflict, it really looks a little bit more like what we have here in front of you. I mean, she's, if we consider that right here is when Dorothy's at home, and then once she faces the conflict with Toto being upset, and then she decides to run away, and we start seeing what her problems are, that's when we start hitting that rising action. And then there's a great storm that produces, a physical conflict again, and she's actually taken into this dreamland state of Oz. And so she plateaus for a bit while she's getting her bearings, if you will, the munchkins. And then she ends up meeting that scarecrow, and she has a little bit of conflict right then, and actually with that witch. I forgot about her in Oz. When she warns Dorothy about being there, and about killing her sister. So that's when we have a lot of tension and a lot of conflict created. And then she meets the scarecrow, and then she meets the Tin Man, and when she's in the forest, and all of those little bits are these points of conflict along the way. But are they the greatest point? Yes or no? You might say that when the wizard gives her that directive to go and get the witch's broom, that's a really big point of conflict, and there might be a little bit of a letdown from that. And then so what happens for us to reach this point? Is this point actually when she defeats the witch? Would we define the witch as the greatest antagonist to Dorothy? Or would we consider the greatest point of conflict to be the point where Dorothy doesn't get to go home and the balloon takes off? Okay, what would we say? Would we put that right here? Or would we put the balloon down here at this point? That's a big question, isn't it? Because if we're defining it externally, we would have to say that the conflict with the witch was the biggest, because everybody gets what they want once they go to the wizard, after a little bit of persuading him. But action-wise, when they're facing the Wicked Witch of the West, that is the greatest point of conflict. You might argue, though, that it actually is when the balloon takes off without Dorothy and she doesn't get her wish. Can I get one more W in there? When she does not get her wish fulfilled, because that's when she actually sees her internal struggle and internal conflict resolved. Because Glenda tells her, the good witch, she tells her that this battle was within her the entire time, and that her ability to overcome it could happen at any time. that it just wasn't this balloon that was going to take her away and take her back home to Kansas, that she would be able to click her heels 3 times and say there's no place like home. And then she'd magically appear in her bed. But it's when she realized that she was never going to go beyond her home anymore in order to find her satisfaction, that she was going to deal with things right there. That's some people would say that that's the greatest point of true conflict, is when she's really upset, but she ends up overcoming that. So I don't care which one you define as long as you're able to tell me the why, which is what I've been doing here for a little bit. And then once it's resolved, she's back in her room, she's with Auntie M, she's with everybody, and she's saying, and you were there. And we know that everything's going to be okay. She's going to be happy, and everybody's going to move on. There's a classic comedy for you. All right, let me just switch my pointer back here for a second to an arrow. And we're going to go to the final page. What I just did at the end of the last slide is a little bit of what you're going to be doing when you actually discuss the idea of plot in a paper or in a discussion posting or as a part of class. We're going to be looking at how we define it. So in studying literature, a reader must consider how well a story's plot is developed. And so it's not just that you're telling about these points, but it's you're evaluating these points. All right. So I've written some sample sentences here on the screen for you, just to help you get a good start for this. So you're going to be defining the plot structure and then evaluating it, and in order to really prove the spots that you're talking about. So if we fill in these blanks, but also describe more. Don't think there's a one-word response that's going to answer this or that's going to neatly finish off all these sentences or statements. You'll have another sentence or so that comes between them, most likely. So if we first define who the protagonist is, so the protagonist is blank, Dorothy in our case with the Wizard of Oz. And the central conflict revolves around an internal conflict with Dorothy not being satisfied at home and thinking that the world had something greater for her outside. And that's the thing she had to overcome. And the conflict of the witch. And some would say that that witch actually resonated and actually represented her discontent. So if we're able to talk about that, like through this first bullet item here, if we're able to discuss that in a sentence or 2 or 3, then we can go on. You might take this opportunity, and I would highly suggest that you take the opportunity to also define who the antagonist is, so that you can help show the conflict in bullet 2. So we're looking here at bullet 2. This means that the plot progression moves to blank. It follows who, all right? So then you would define the beginning and end of the exposition. Well, the beginning is obviously the beginning of the story, the first word that's on the page. Maybe you could even consider the title. So the exposition begins here and it ends where, which is where we learn what. All right? Then the rising action. Okay, when you start seeing the conflict come along and the issue coming along, whether that is through a formal villain or a formal antagonist, or when you see it internally with Dorothy, when she starts running away and her reasoning for running away. That's when we would see that it changes into the rising action. And then you can define all the bumps and conflicts along the way that happen until you get to the climax. And so where does the rising action actually change into the climax? And describe that. And you state because what happens. And that makes the highest point of conflict blank because of what. And so describe that a little bit more. And the declining action begins to occur where and why does that happen? And then finally, the same for the resolution. Where is the breaking point between that declining action and the resolution in that work? So we're talking not just the 5 or 6 sentences that you see on the screen. We're talking more description than that too. You got to justify why you pinpointed at that spot rather than another. So the evaluation part comes on with these last 2 bullet points. The plot is believable or unbelievable, realistic or unrealistic, and being able to define, it's an internal conflict or an external conflict or whatever. You can bring all those qualities in here to help define it, define what the plot actually is, and state the reasons why for that answer. And then finally, the climax cannot be which point. So that's where we have that debate, the which or the balloon, maybe. Or you think about story of an hour. When's the highest point that you think is happening? And then what is actually the highest point? If you were to say the climax cannot be the first one because blank happens and why that happens and why is that the bigger deal for that protagonist. And that's how I justified my balloon being the highest point of conflict rather than um, the defeat of the witch, is because until Dorothy really dealt with her issues, there couldn't be a declining action, a true declining action. We couldn't get her home yet. So that's how you're able to discuss these things and really evaluate and think through. And you're probably saying, where am I going to use this in real life? Well, many places. You will start doing this when you're looking at movies, but you're also learning how to categorize a little differently than you ever have before. And so it's going to help you with a lot of critical thinking skills in other areas. And if you're going to be a psychologist, a social worker, a teacher, any business where you have to deal with people, and you're really looking at the progression of something that has to happen, even if it's creating a business plan or thinking through the best customer service plan or something. These skills of being able to dissect these things are really going to help you long term. And furthermore, the next part of this, okay, this would be maybe an argument in class, a journal entry or a posting. And what comes after that? The actual discussion in class, right? In an online class, it's a response to a posting. No, I disagree. It can't be that spot because of blah. Or I do agree that it's this spot because of this, but I don't agree with this part of what you're saying. I mean, this is where the argument and the coming to terms with, okay, what is the real climax? What is the real answer, if you will, comes alive. So this is one of the most fun things, I think, to really discuss and debate, especially when you have a work that there's no real clear hero or heroine, or the main characters are all so strong that it's really debatable what the true issue is. What the true issue is, but there's such complexities behind the story that it just comes to life. Okay. Now, one more thing. Obviously, you can't use these sentences verbatim. I mean, to just fill in those blanks would be lame. It would not describe what you need to in order to prove your case. But you should feel free to use this sample, this template, in order to get you going with your posting or your journal entry or your paper even, because you can divide it and keep explaining and keep elaborating based off of this, but just don't use it word for word, whatever you do. So with Chopin's work, with Kate Chopin's The Story of an Hour, you're going to have a similar dilemma to what Dorothy did. Which is the real climax? And don't just assume that it's one and not the other. You're going to be debating this idea quite a bit. So really think that through and use this as a template to help you. Okay. So now it's time to do it. Go and read that story one more time so that you can absolutely be certain. Start writing about plot, about this particular work, and just see how it turns out, see how exciting it is, see what you can write and justify.